Have you ever lived somewhere that looked peaceful, clean lawns, quiet streets, friendly smiles, but underneath it felt like you were being watched? Like every little thing you did was being measured, judged, and fined? Yeah, that was my life in an HOA neighborhood. Before we dive in, we would love to ask, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments and let's see how far this story travels. So, I rented a house in what seemed like a perfect neighborhood. At first glance, it was everything you imagine when you hear the words HOA community. Lawns neatly trimmed, sidewalks clean, the occasional kid riding their bike, waves from neighbors. It felt calm, organized, and even a little idyllic. But the longer I lived there, the more I realized that under the surface, this peaceful neighborhood was anything but peaceful. Everything was fine in the beginning, just normal stuff. There were rules about lawn maintenance, garbage pickup, and mailboxes. But the tension came in small, subtle ways. You know, the kind of tension where you're enjoying your morning coffee and then you spot a neighbor's gaze from across the street, or you find a notice on your door about something you didn't even know was a rule. Every now and then, a few HOA board members would roll around the neighborhood, checking driveways and lawns, handing out fines for the smallest infractions. Dirty driveways, leaves in the gutters, a mailbox slightly crooked. I wouldn't have minded so much if the HOA had been consistent, but the hypocrisy was unreal. The president of the HOA and one of the board members lived on the same street as me. You would think with that kind of proximity they'd set a good example. Nope. Their driveways were in complete disrepair. Cracks, oil stains, weeds poking through, a total disaster. But God forbid a few rust-colored streaks appeared on my concrete, or a little dust settled on my walkway. That was worth a fine. One example stands out and I swear it still makes me laugh in disbelief. The board member's son worked on his truck in their driveway, and a massive oil spill occurred. Someone had partially covered it with a red towel, and the towel just sat there for 8 months. 8 months. Yet somehow, a few tiny marks on my driveway, completely unintentional, were a major violation in their eyes. And then, the speed bumps. Oh, the speed bumps. You might think speed bumps are normal, safe, and necessary. They are, when installed correctly. But in this neighborhood, the HOA decided that the existing bumps weren't doing their job. The original ones were perfectly fine, graded just enough to slow down traffic without damaging vehicles. But the HOA wanted to teach drivers a lesson. The only accident that occurred while I was living there wasn't some random teen speeding down the street. No, it was the spouse of a HOA board member. Driving full speed into a tree. Meanwhile, we were constantly receiving mailings telling everyone to slow down. This is not a racetrack. Their solution? Literally turning the main street into an obstacle course. They installed these aggressive, man-made asphalt cliffs they called speed bumps. Let me tell you, these things weren't just bumps. They were a test of your patience, your vehicle, and your nerves. If you wanted to drive over them without damaging your car, you had to perform a careful, multi-step maneuver. Slow down, ease up the first side, come to a complete stop, then inch down the drop for your front wheels, followed by the rear. And this had to be repeated for every single bump. A car with low suspension? Forget it. You were basically out of luck. Of course, some neighbors got creative. A few people just started driving on the grass around the speed bumps. The HOA responded with, you guessed it, concrete barriers on the grass. Now it was no longer about slowing cars, it was about asserting control, about sending a message, we are watching and we will punish. But the universe has a sense of humor. Not long after, someone poured diesel fuel on the speed bumps the day before garbage collection. Complete destruction. They were obliterated. The HOA had no choice but to reinstall them, somehow making them even more aggressive than before. A week later, Captain Diesel, because that's what everyone started calling the mystery saboteur, struck again. Boom. Gone. Eventually, the HOA gave up on trying to control people with man-made mountains in the middle of the road. They simply paved over the wreckage. It was beautiful, finally a smooth street again. They did eventually install speed bumps again, but this time they used the standard plastic kind that bolt to the street, much less aggressive and infinitely more tolerable. The lesson? No matter how much control they thought they had, people will always find a way to push back. And while the speed bumps were an ongoing saga, that was just one chapter of a larger story of living in an HOA-controlled neighborhood. From unsolicited inspections to surprise fines, from absurd rules to the constant scrutiny of every little action, life in this neighborhood felt less like community and more like being trapped under a microscope. I remember one instance clearly. I planted a small flower bed along my driveway. It was nothing extravagant, just a few flowers to brighten up the front of my house. Within a week, there was a notice tacked to my door. Flowerbed not compliant with HOA regulations. Remove immediately. I looked at the flowerbed, looked at the note, and just laughed. The HOA had absolutely no consistency, yet somehow I was the one breaking the rules. It wasn't just the ridiculous fines that got to me, it was the constant sense of being watched. The feeling that someone, somewhere, was scrutinizing every little choice you made. It doesn't matter if your lawn is perfectly trimmed, or if you park your car correctly. There was always some invisible measuring stick, some arbitrary standard that you didn't meet, and it was always punishable. And here's the irony. These people, the board members, had no accountability. Their own houses were in worse shape than anyone else's. Their own rules didn't apply to them. Yet we were expected to live by an impossible standard of perfection. Every lawn, every driveway, every mailbox was a potential infraction. And you couldn't argue because arguing only made them double down on the rules. Living there was exhausting, mentally draining, and at times downright surreal. You started noticing things you'd never cared about before. Did my trash can line up perfectly with the curb? Were my hedges exactly 3 feet tall? Did I leave my mailbox slightly ajar? These questions haunted every mundane moment. And if you got it wrong, instant fine. But through all of it there were little victories. Small acts of rebellion that reminded us we weren't powerless. The speed bump saga was one of them. And every time Captain Diesel struck, it was like a tiny beacon of hope that maybe, just maybe, the HOA wasn't untouchable. The longer I lived there, the more I realized the truth. HOAs are like any form of authority. They can make rules, they can enforce them, and they can instill fear. But if people find clever, harmless ways to push back, they're forced to compromise. The community may look peaceful on the surface, but beneath it, there's always tension, resistance, and the occasional bit of chaos. And so my life in this HOA neighborhood continued, with all its absurdities, fines, and tiny rebellions. It wasn't just about speed bumps or flowerbeds. It was about living under constant surveillance, learning to navigate impossible rules, and finding moments of freedom wherever you could. And honestly, despite all the headaches, it made life a lot more interesting than I ever expected. Because in a place where everything is monitored and controlled, the smallest victories feel enormous. So, after surviving the speed bump saga, I thought maybe things would settle down a bit. I was wrong. If the speed bumps were the fun introduction to HOA life, the next chapter was pure chaos wrapped in paperwork. It all started with the mailbox. You might think a mailbox is harmless, just a place for letters and bills. No. In this neighborhood, even mailboxes were under strict surveillance. The HOA had a regulation that all mailboxes had to be painted the exact same shade of navy blue. I'm not kidding. Not a slightly different navy, not a hint lighter or darker, exactly the shade they chose. And of course, if your mailbox didn't match, fines would roll in like clockwork. I had just painted mine when I got a notice. Mailbox color not compliant. Repaint immediately or face penalties. I stood there, brush in hand, trying to compare my mailbox to the HOA-approved sample. They were the same. I double-checked. Maybe triple-checked. Still, it wasn't enough. The HOA inspector came by, notebook in hand, as if he were Sherlock Holmes investigating a crime scene. My mailbox? A crime scene apparently. And it wasn't just the mailboxes. Every little detail of your property was monitored. I once left a garden gnome slightly askew. Within 2 days there was a notice, improper placement of yard ornament. Adjust immediately. At this point I began to develop a sixth sense for HOA eyes. I could feel them staring from across the street, hidden behind hedges, peeking through curtains. Then there was the infamous annual inspection week. This was every resident's nightmare. You'd get a notice a month in advance saying, HOA inspection will occur between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. on specific date. Ensure all compliance measures are met. They didn't say maybe or approximately. No, it was absolute. And they expected perfection. Lawns needed trimming, trash cans hidden, fences pressure washed, walkways spotless. I remember one year my neighbor spent 3 straight days trimming his bushes, pruning, shaping, leveling. He even hired a professional gardener just to survive the inspection. Meanwhile, across the street, the HOA board member's own front yard looked like a jungle. Dead leaves, overgrown hedges, a swing set leaning dangerously. Did they get a fine? Of course not. And then there was the parking situation. Every vehicle had to be parked in a certain way. Streets were off limits after 10 p.m. Guest parking was heavily restricted. One night, my cousin came to visit. He parked on the street for 5 minutes while unloading his bags. Next morning, a $75 fine. No warnings. Just a crisp note on his windshield saying, violation of HOA parking regulations. Meanwhile, the board member's teenage kid had 3 cars lining the street every night. Nothing. Zero consequences. But the crown jewel of absurdity? The pool rules. If you thought speed bumps and mailboxes were bad, wait until you hear this. The pool had a schedule posted down to the minute. No running, no diving, no glass containers. And don't even think about bringing outside furniture. You want it to float in a noodle for 5 minutes? Not without paperwork. And of course, if you broke a rule, even accidentally, you'd be fined. One afternoon, a little girl from the neighborhood accidentally kicked a soccer ball into the pool area. That's all it took. Her parents received a $50 fine for disturbing HOA property. I watched this unfold while sipping my coffee, shaking my head. It was as if the rules themselves were designed to drain joy from life. But not everything was doom and gloom. There were small moments of rebellion, little victories that reminded us we weren't powerless. Some neighbors started leaving humorous signs in their yards. Warning, lawn may contain HOA violation. Or, smile. You're being watched. Captain Diesel's speed bump sabotage became legendary. And one brave soul even painted their mailbox neon pink overnight, daring the HOA to enforce the navy blue rule. They never sent a fine. Everyone celebrated that small victory. Despite all this chaos, living in the HOA neighborhood taught me something important. Control is an illusion. No matter how strict the rules, no matter how closely they watch, there's always room for creativity, for resistance. People will find ways to push back, to reclaim a sense of freedom. Whether it's tiny acts of defiance or just laughing at the absurdity of it all, the human spirit finds a way. And that's the strange beauty of HOA life. On the surface it looks neat, orderly, controlled. But underneath it's chaotic, messy, full of contradictions, and, surprisingly, kind of fun once you learn to play the game. You learn which battles are worth fighting and which are just for entertainment. By this point I had stories piling up like letters in a mailbox. Speed bumps, fines, inspections, parking wars, and the constant sense of being watched. It was a never-ending sitcom starring real people. And every day brought a new episode, another absurd rule, another opportunity to find humor in the madness. So, if you're watching this and thinking about moving into an HOA, buckle up. It's not all perfect lawns and quiet streets. There's a whole world of chaos, creativity, and a little bit of rebellion waiting for you. And trust me, once you experience it, you'll never forget it. That I had learned one very important lesson. In this neighborhood, nothing is as simple as it seems. Rules are arbitrary, inspections are relentless, and even the smallest victory feels like winning the lottery. But it wasn't all punishment and fines. Sometimes the HOA's own absurdity created opportunities for payback, clever rebellion, and a little chaos that kept life interesting. One of the most legendary stories during my time there involved the infamous holiday decorations war. It started innocently enough. It was December and most of the neighborhood was putting up lights, wreaths, and inflatable snowmen. I went all out. Lights on the roof, around the windows, little pathway lanterns. It looked festive, cheerful, and maybe a little over the top, but nothing crazy. Then I got a notice. Inflatable decorations not compliant with HOA regulations. Please remove immediately or face fines. I couldn't believe it. Christmas spirit wasn't allowed. I looked around. Across the street, the HOA president had a massive inflatable Santa that took up half his yard. Nothing. Zero notices. The hypocrisy was incredible. So, a few neighbors and I decided to push back, politely, humorously, and creatively. One evening we all went outside and added little complaint signs to our decorations. Fine me if you dare. And HOA, is this too festive for you? Overnight, photos of these signs spread throughout the neighborhood. It became a small celebration. Everyone laughed and no fines were ever issued. That tiny act of defiance reminded us all that even the strictest HOA can't suppress humor forever. Then came the mystery of the disappearing signs. The HOA had strict rules about posting anything in your yard. No advertisements, political signs, or personal messages. Naturally, some neighbors got creative. Overnight, they started posting humorous, anonymous signs poking fun at the board. Beware of HOA ninjas and smile. You're being watched became regular appearances. For weeks, the HOA tried to remove them, but somehow the signs kept coming back. It was like living in a comic book where the villains are powerful, but the townspeople have tricks up their sleeves. Of course, fines were still a constant threat. One neighbor got a notice for a non-compliant doormat. I kid you not, a doormat. Another received a fine for having too many flowers in their garden. The absurdity was endless. And yet, through all of it, a sense of camaraderie grew. Neighbors started helping each other navigate the labyrinth of rules, sharing strategies, tips, and even templates for appeal letters. It was like living in a secret society, united against the arbitrary tyranny of perfectly manicured lawns and overly serious inspectors. But the biggest moment came with the final showdown, the ultimate driveway showdown. The HOA board had just introduced new regulations about driveway stains. Rust streaks, oil spots, tire marks, everything had to be spotless. But here's the kicker. The board members themselves had driveways that were completely covered in oil, grease, and debris. That's right. After months of strict enforcement, the hypocrisy reached its peak. So, a few of us decided to test the limits. Using harmless chalk, we outlined our stains with funny messages. Oops! Is this bad enough for a fine? And HOA inspector, free samples here. The next day inspectors came by, saw the outlines, and for the first time, paused. Nobody issued fines. They couldn't. It was too ridiculous. We had exposed the absurdity, and for a moment the neighborhood felt a little freer. Living there wasn't just about the rules, fines, or inspections. It was about learning how to adapt, laugh, and occasionally push back. It was about finding the little victories that reminded us we weren't powerless. Whether it was Captain Diesel and the speed bumps, holiday decorations, disappearing signs, or chalk outline stains, life in an HOA neighborhood was a constant game of strategy, patience, and creativity. By the end, I realized something important. HOAs aren't just about control, they're about community in a strange, twisted way. They push you to pay attention, to care, to notice the little things. And while their methods are often absurd, the bonds formed among neighbors navigating the madness are genuine. Shared struggles, shared laughter, and small victories create stories that last far longer than any fine notice. And that, more than anything, is the lesson. Life in an HOA is weird, chaotic, and sometimes infuriating, but it's also hilarious, unpredictable, and strangely rewarding. It's about finding freedom within rules, humor within absurdity, and camaraderie in shared resistance. So, if you've ever lived in an HOA, or are thinking about it, remember this. Keep your sense of humor, watch your mailbox color, be ready for inspections, and never underestimate the power of a well-placed joke or a tiny act of rebellion. Because in the end, the HOA might control the streets, the lawns, and the mailboxes, but they can't control your creativity, your wit, or your spirit. Before we wrap up, we'd love to ask, what's the craziest HOA story you've ever heard or experienced? Drop it in the comments. We want to see how far this story travels. And remember, behind the clean lawns and quiet streets, there's always a little chaos waiting to be uncovered.